Picture a brain about the size of a walnut. Now picture it perched on a wire above your street, watching you walk by, quietly deciding whether you count as a problem. You probably passed a dozen of them this week without a second thought. They did not pass you. The crow clocked your face. And here's the strange part. There's a decent chance it remembered. So, today, let's step into another mind. Not to ask how clever a crow is, because honestly we'll get to the clever, but to ask the harder things sitting underneath it. What is it actually like, on the inside, to be one? For a long time, our question about animals was basically a ranking question. How smart is it? Smarter than a dog, dumber than a chimp, slotted somewhere on a ladder with us sitting comfortably at the top. But a philosopher named Thomas Nagel pointed out, back in 1974, that the ladder quietly hides the real mystery. Think about it like this. I could hand you the full wiring diagram of a bat, or a crow, or the person sitting next to you, and you'd still be standing outside the window, looking in, guessing. The experience itself doesn't show up on the diagram. So before we ask how smart a crow is, the more honest move is to sit with the question Nagel made famous, just pointed at feathers instead of fur. What is it like to be this thing? So, let's start with the hardware, because the numbers, they're a little ridiculous. You're walking around with roughly 86 billion neurons, about 16 billion of them crammed into your cortex, the wrinkly part that does most of your thinking. A crow's entire brain would barely cover a coin. By every old assumption, that should add up to a simple, little animal running on autopilot. It doesn't. In 2016, a research team led by Søren Olkowicz actually counted the neurons in bird brains and found something nobody really expected. Birds, like crows, pack neurons into their forebrain at densities that rival primates in a tiny fraction of the space. So the crow isn't running a weaker copy of your mind. It's running a totally different design that quietly arrived at the same place, the way two inventors on opposite sides of the planet who never met and never shared a note can land on the exact same machine, same result, completely separate blueprint. Now, here's where it gets personal. In 2010, John Marsluff and his team at the University of Washington pulled on rubber masks, went outside, and briefly trapped some wild crows before letting them go unharmed. The crows did not forget that face. For years afterward, whenever anyone wore that exact mask, the birds scolded it, dive-bombed it, sounded the alarm. And this is the part that genuinely got me. Crows that had never been trapped, some not even alive when it happened, somehow learned to hate the mask too. The warning spread, parent to chick, neighbor to neighbor, kind of like a rumor with wings. And it doesn't fade fast. Some of those grudges have been tracked across years, outlasting the memory you'd keep of a stranger who once gave you a weird look on the street. So, picture your own face, filed away inside a brain the size of a coin, tagged as dangerous, and passed around a neighborhood you will never meet. To you, a crow is just noise on a wire. To the crow, you might be a name it warns its kids about. But the strangest clue is also the most recent. And it's basically the reason this episode exists. In 2020, a neuroscientist named Andreas Nieder ran an experiment that asked a question most people assumed you simply couldn't ask a bird. Not, can it think? But, does it have an experience at all? For most of the history of science, that wasn't even treated as a real question for an animal, let alone a bird. Birds were reflexes with wings. Nieder decided to actually test it, walk it through slowly. He trained carrion crows to report when they saw a faint flash of light. Sometimes the flash was obvious, but sometimes it sat right at the edge of visible, the exact same dim signal hitting the eye. And the crow would sometimes report seeing it, and sometimes report nothing. Identical light, different answer. That gap is the interesting bit, because when Nieder recorded the crow's neurons, he found cells that didn't track the light. They tracked what the crow reported seeing. When the bird noticed the flash, the neurons fired. When it missed the very same flash, they stayed quiet. The brain wasn't just detecting the world, it was registering an experience of it, a faint flicker of something it might be like to sit behind those eyes. And that's a signature scientists once assumed you needed a mammal's cortex to produce. The crow doesn't have one. It got there anyway. So, what is it like to be a crow? Here's the honest answer. We still don't know. And Nagel would say, we never fully will. You can measure the flicker now. You can watch the exact neuron light up the second the bird notices the world, but you still can't climb inside that second and feel it. We keep trying to measure the crow against ourselves, as if the only question worth asking is how close to human it gets. We treat the whole thing as a ladder, with the crow a few rungs down. Thilo's notebook says otherwise. Maybe how close it is to us was never the point, because the science keeps pointing somewhere quietly humbling. A crow is not a smaller, dumber draft of you. It's a separate experiment in being awake, built from different parts, on a different branch, arriving at its own version of an inner life that we're only now learning how to detect. There is a mind on the wire above your street, watching the morning, maybe feeling it in a way you will never get to share. We share a planet with countless versions of awake, and we've spent most of our history assuming ours was the only one that really counted. We spent so long asking whether crows were clever enough to matter. Maybe. The better question is, how much of the world has quietly been looking back at us this whole time while we just kept walking? And that should humble us. Stay curious. If you want to meet a mind even stranger than this one, the bat is sitting in the next one over, waiting.